Hello and welcome to the wonderful world of wine. We are your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay, exploring all things wine with you. If you'd like to get more information about our show, please find us on Facebook at The Wonderful World of Wine. Once again, Kim and I have found a bunch of wine topics that we'd like to discuss with you today. And the first one, Kim, is from Decanter magazine about contamination of wine by money. And when I first saw the title of this article, what came to me is something we talked about just recently was Wine Spectator magazine. Mm-hmm. I always feel it's influenced by money, by advertising, but that wasn't really the gist of it.
Well, it was a little bit of that. This is a little more of a philosophical article. You know, it doesn't talk about necessarily the taste of wine or what dishes it goes with, but about how over the last 30 or 40 years, wine prices have gone up so much for those top tier bottles that for a lot of people, they are unattainable.
Yeah, and they said in this, Kim, I don't know what your thought is, but they said money is worse than sulfur in wine.
Yeah, I know. Now, I agree with that one.
Wow.
Money is wine's biggest contaminant, is what author Andrew Jeffords says in this article from Decanter, and that so many of these high prestige bottles are really only used for people as investments, and that rarely do people even drink them, which I think is a shame because wines are beverages. You know, they should be part of your meal. It's a food product. It's an agricultural product, and to lock them away in a bottle and just trade them as if they were widgets, it makes me very sad.
Yeah, so they were saying fine wine costs money. People that are buying fine wine have money, and then they're buying this wine to make more money.
Right.
So it was just kept linking back to money.
And that it almost makes, when the price gets so high for a bottle, it's almost like the wine inside the bottle isn't real any longer. It's just a thing.
Yeah, it's shocking. They mentioned numbers, and they were saying the national average salary is, was it $865 a week for salary, and they can't afford at that salary a $200 bottle of wine. So that's why in the United States, and I hear this all the time on Shark Tank when he talks wine, that the average price paid in the U.S. for a bottle of wine is $8.98. $8.98, which is, to me, it means a lot, right, mm-hmm. Kim? I mean, talking money, and the average bottle is under $10 that everyone's buying, but the people with money are buying all these expensive bottles.
Right.
Scary.
A little scary.
No?
A little scary.
You're speechless there.
Yeah. You know, and it's sort of sad because he mentions in this that in, say, 1980, who really, regardless of who you were, if you had a little bit of disposable cash and you wanted to try a special bottle of wine, you could buy one of the best vintages of Bordeaux ever for under $100 a bottle. Now, granted, that was in the early 80s, but we're not talking $2,000 a bottle for top wines in the world. They were still relatively easy to get your hands on. Also, there were fewer people drinking wine at that point. It's always, especially at this tier, always been considered a prestige item. But if you had more knowledge than you had dollars, you were able to get your hands on some pretty awesome stuff. And now the pricing for those top tier Bordeaux's and Burgundies and some of the better things from these more traditional regions really are out of reach. I know personally that I'm never going to be able to have these wines in my cellar. You know, every once in a while I might be able to have a taste of something at a special event, but chances are these are not things that are going to end up in my life.
A lot of those people you're talking about, Kim, they'll probably had a good wine knowledge to know to buy Bordeaux and buy Burgundy. So, I mean, they had a heads up anyway, plus they had money.
Well, that's where I said that the knowledge was there, but the money wasn't necessarily. But now it's almost reverse now. It's like you need the dollars, and the knowledge is a little bit easier to come by.
I agree with that. And I thought it was very eye-opening how they mentioned a few points about wine critics, how the wine critics are actually feeding the money people based on rating of the money wines, the high-end wines, and also that these wine writers or wine critics, like us, Kim, we can taste, because we're in the industry, like we taste the top 100 wines, but we're not buying them. So it was interesting that the people that are rating them are not really the people putting the money towards the wine.
Right.
They're feeding cheating the people to buy them with the money. So it's how it linked it all back. It kept coming back, money, money, money.
Yep. And it is supply and demand, because a lot of these are pretty limited production. So because there are more people out there who want to buy them and want to trade them or invest in them and maybe eventually consume them, that there is more of a demand for these wines than there is a supply. So the prices can then go up, and they will always be able to find people to buy them.
And this was really related, the article, on the consumer, I feel, the end of the money problem in wine. Not looking at corporations who are putting out the wine, right? It's more the buyers of the wine. So
But you really can't blame the producers if they can get $1,500 for a bottle of wine and somebody's going to buy it. I can't blame them for putting that price tag on there.
I was kind of thinking more towards the terms of corporate wineries and monies they put towards things differently. You know what I mean? Not the consumer.
Yeah, it's not that.
Yeah, you're right. If there's a demand, and recently I think the Chinese now have such a demand. It's a status thing in China to bring someone over and have a $1,000 bottle on your shelf. So all of that stuff is being scooped up.
Yep, that's absolutely part of the issue.
Yeah, and if you're a producer and you can get $1,000 in China and $500 in the U.S., what are you going to do? I mean,
kind of a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, so that's another where money is impacting the wine world.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. We're your hosts, Mark and Kim. You can find out information about myself at my website, vinitaswineworks.com, and you can find out more information about Mark at his website, franklinliquors.com. Very informative article in Forbes magazine about champagne labels. And we talk a lot about wine labels, whether it's American wine labels or European wine labels, and how to get the most out of that label for your own understanding of what's in the bottle. And champagne really is a creature unto itself. And I don't mean all sparkling wines. I mean wines specifically from the region of Champagne in northern France. And there is a lot of info on that label if you just look at it and know what you're reading.
I like, Kim, when we find articles that focus on things that we like to talk about, labels and champagne or sparkling wine in one.
Put them both together. It's great.
We get excited over these things, and people are saying, what is there on a champagne bottle that we need to know? It's actually a pretty good trick for what I would say is value in how to find a champagne.
Agreed.
So they were saying since 1979, there's 9 mandatory label requirements for champagne, and one of them is a 2-letter code, and we'd like to go through what those letter codes are.
Right. So also what is necessary on a champagne label is that it has to have the word champagne on it. So that is the AOC. So that is what the government has delineated as the production area of champagne. So it must say AOC Champagne. It'll tell you who the producer is or who the house is, because in Champagne they talk about houses instead of producers. And what I also consider to be almost the most important thing on a champagne label, which is the style. And this is what a lot of people want to know. Is it a dry champagne? Is it a sweet champagne? Is it somewhere in between? So style is very important. You might see terms like brut or sometimes extra dry, demi-sec, which is the sweeter style. So keep an eye out for those style terms on the bottle.
So style is basically sugar levels.
Sugar levels.
Sugar
exactly.
levels in that bottle.
Right. Alcohol, volume. Those are the typical things that you would see. But then there's this other code, sort of code words on the label, like Mark just referenced, that will tell you more about how the grapes or where the grapes are grown and by whom and who is actually making the champagne. So why don't we walk everyone through this, Mark?
Yes. So first, they're assigned, each wine maker is assigned a specific number. So on the label, you're going to see a series of numbers followed by 2 letters. And it's usually on the back, very small for me because my eyes are. And those 2 letters are what we will talk about now. And before getting to the letters, just a few stats on the producers themselves. They say there's about 16,000 growers in Champagne, 319 villages producers grow 90% of the vineyard. So it's big. It's a big production.
And it's important to remember that unlike a lot of other French wines produced, Champagne is all about brand. And we talk about brands a lot when we talk about California wines, and we don't tend to emphasize them when we talk about European wines. So like there's not a whole lot of producers in France that we consider to be like big brands. You know, there are a couple in Beaujolais and in Burgundy like Jadot or Duboeuf that we kind of think of more as branded wines. But Champagne is the place where you really have more of an idea of this is a brand, this is a style. You know, these are names that people are familiar with like Moet or Veuve Clicquot or Bollinger or Tattinger. You know, all these we tend to think of them as producers, but it's more truthful to think about them as brands.
I'm glad you mentioned brands, Kim, because these letter codes we're going to talk about actually will help you decipher how big a brand
Right, you'll be able to figure out if this is a brand or if it's more like a small production, hands-on kind of a wine. So that's pretty cool.
So once again, you look at the Champagne label, you turn it around. Usually you're going to see a series of numbers and then two letters. And the first one we want to talk about is NM, which is probably the most well-known term you'll see.
Right. So NM stands for Négociant Manipulant. And it, again, like Mark just said, is the most common bottlings out there are going to have this designation.
And it may or may not mean that it's owned by a vineyard that's
Right.
producing the grapes that are in this bottle. What else, Kim, would you say is a key when you see this?
I tend to think of these as larger production. A lot of these producers have been around for a very, very long time, like think hundreds of years. These champagne houses, a lot of these champagne houses were established in the 1600s. So they really have been around for a really long time. And some of them are quite big. So these are champagne houses that are established. They have winemaking staff and they either own their own vineyards or they tend to purchase grapes from growers that they have long-standing relationships with. So it's not that they are lower quality because they're really not, but it's more the way that their company is structured.
So it's like you said, Kim, it's a bigger brand that buying mostly from growers, and then they're making a house style of champagne every year
Right.
with grapes they're buying from probably different people all the time or sources they use all the time that are growing differently every year.
Right. But they usually will blend and they will try to make a consistent style year in and year out so that whether you had it this year or whether you had it 5 years ago, if you find a style that you like from a particular brand of champagne, they will try to make it the same so that it tastes the same to you whether you have it now or in 5 years.
So then next you turn around, you see a series of numbers and you see the letters RM.
So instead of négociant manipulant, you have récoltant manipulant. And we in the industry refer to these as grower champagnes. And this just means that the same person or group of people who grew the grapes are also making the wine as well.
And this has been trending probably for the last 3 years. People learning these codes and saying, wow, I can get a bottle of champagne that the guy's actually growing this fruit and making this product. So I think they mentioned they call it Farmer Fizz in France. So really good value. Probably it's sometimes less price point than the big brands.
Really? I find them to be the opposite.
Yeah, you see more expensive?
I find them to be more expensive.
I guess we're still talking $40, $50, right? So
you're not going to find any of these under like $30 a bottle. So some of the better ones that I've had of these grower champagnes have been in more like the $75, $80 price point. But it's nice if you see these because you know that it's a little bit more small production, more hands-on, and they aren't necessarily going to be the same year in and year out. So if you like that about wine and discovering new labels and new bottles and new flavors, these could be a great way to go.
So the NM and the RM are probably the top two, but there are 5 more, Kim, and the next is CM.
Which means that it's a cooperative production where a lot of growers are getting together and growing the grapes and then making the wine as well or selling off. I was a little confused, honestly, about the description of this one.
I would assume that they could be a grower themselves, but then also be part of a co-op. So maybe that's the difference. And they're saying there's about 100 co-ops. So I'm assuming of those 100, there's people that are doing their own RM RM versions of sparkling as well, of champagne.
Or it could be that they're all pooling their resources and then producing one label under the label of the co-op, which makes it different from the next category, which is RC, Récoltant, cooperateur, which is also a co-op, but then each individual member of the co-op gets their own label. So I think that's the difference between the two co-op labels, is that one, everybody gets their own label, and then the other one, they're labeling them all as one product.
And it might be some sort of fallback system too, is if it's a bad vintage, less production, maybe these are just technicalities and labeling.
Okay, sure. So maybe there's a co-op system, and in one year they might all just bottle under the same label, but then in better years they all get their own.
Yeah, so they can still produce and make money. The next one, Kim, was ND.
This is another one of those negociant ones, but instead of it being the negociant is producing the champagne, this is more of a distribution and relabeling system. So the negociant will purchase finished wine, not grapes, but they will purchase the actual finished champagne and then put their very own label on it.
So you're talking about the other ones being confusing. I was confused between this term and the next one where it says MA. So ND and MA, because MA is third party producing their own sparkling champagne.
Right. So I think the difference is that for the negociant, you have one, say, company putting their label on it. But then if they were selling that to a restaurant or to, say, Trader Joe's, and then Trader Joe's puts its own label on it, then that's when it falls into the MA category. So it's a private label specifically for that next step of the distribution chain, either a restaurant or a store.
But you can't associate that with a co-op or a single grower, correct?
No, I guess you can't.
According to the labeling law, but
yep, it would have to be labeled as something different.
Kind of confusing, but it's French, so we assume that's going to happen. And then the last term that you could see following the numbers on a label would be SR,
which is another co-op system. This was the one that I was confused about. I have no idea what they're talking about here.
They're saying the growers make it and they market it themselves, which I guess is the other co-op or the other growers, they have other people market for them. So this was being they do everything themselves. So I would assume this is very rare in the United States to find this, because
I would think so.
They have no one to really support and market for them.
Because they would have to find an importer, they would have to find different distributors for each of the states. That adds extra levels of complexity for the growers.
There were a few things, Kim, also in the article I just want to touch base with you on. And one of them was, maybe a lot of listeners don't know this, but in Champagne, all the grapes must be hand harvested. And that labor requires 100,000 pickers each season. Imagine that.
Yep. And that's
a lot
I think
of labor.
One of the reasons why champagne can be so expensive is because there is a lot of labor that goes into champagne. So not only do you need to have all these people picking your grapes and paying attention to when they're picking the grapes and all those things, but there's a lot of manipulation that goes on of the wine in the cellar because of just the champagne process. It's a multi-step process that is way more complex than making a still wine. So there is a lot of labor, there's a lot of time, there's a lot of extra effort that goes into sparkling wine. And that's one of the reasons why the price is usually a little bit higher.
Also, the article noted, Kim, and all the time we talk about champagne, we always learn about the big 3 grapes that go in. And they were saying there's actually 7 allowed varietals that can go into champagne. And I was kind of educationally, that was like, wow, I knew of 4, but I didn't know there were 7 that they could use. And I'm assuming this is like another backup. If there's a bad vintage, they might have something that grows on the side they might use for other things.
Or that was traditionally used in champagne in the past and has been slowly but surely, there's less and less of these grapes in those vineyards. And so they're kind of moving beyond those grapes and are now really only growing the Chardonnay, the Pinot Noir, and the Pinot Meunier.
Thank you for listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. We're your hosts, Mark Lindsay and Kim Simone, exploring all things wine with you. If you'd like to get more information about Kim, please go to her website at vinitaswineworks.com. If you'd like to get more information about myself, please go to franklinliquors.com. And if you'd like to follow our show, please find us on iTunes or SoundCloud at The Wonderful World of Wine. Next, Kim, we found a interesting article in drinkbusiness.com about how vineyards in France are investing in bats to protect their grapes.
I think this is a great example of something we call integrated pest management, which is a category of sustainable and environmentally friendly pest control, where you have other things, other creatures in your vineyard that take care of the other little creatures in your vineyard that you don't necessarily want there. So there are some that will use ladybugs to eat smaller bugs on the grapevines. There are a lot of bird programs, so whether they're hawks or some other birds that are used to keep small pests under control. And now we're seeing bats. And this was experiment done in France, in the Dordogne region, which is near Bordeaux. And there were a number of vineyards that tried to make their habitat be very friendly to this certain variety of bats, which would then eat these moths that were pests to their vineyards.
So this is more of a biodynamic type of thing where the vineyard is its own ecosystem and they bring things in to take care of other things. They feel it's natural instead of hitting things with pesticides to control the moths. It's healthier for the vine. It's better for you as a consumer that these things are not getting in your wine. And the only question when I was reading it, they said the bats were introduced. So how are they doing this? Are they like going to the pet store and buying bats? Or because then they mentioned they tried it in 23 plots of land and they found 19 out of 22 species of bats were there. So I'm assuming somehow they enticed them to come to the vineyard and they didn't bring them in. But I don't know how. I mean,
or they just introduced more of a population of a bat that was naturally going to be in that area anyway, and there was a ready food source because they concentrated on bats that would eat the particular moths that were there and that were being pests in the vineyard. And then they analyzed which bats were eating which moths, and I thought that was quite fascinating as well.
So you mentioned earlier, Kim, about we've read in the past stories about vineyards that bring in hawks or birds, and I've seen where they build these special little bird houses and they put things in, and that attracts that species of bird and hawk. So, I mean, I think this is really great. In one instance I've seen in California where they actually have people that they hire these people that have hawks to come in for the day and scare away whatever's in the vineyards, and then they won't come back because they feel that hawk is coming back. So.
Yeah, and this is very useful for French wine growers in particular because there is so much pesticide use in grape growing, and we've seen the numbers for France where it's something like agriculturally, I think 10% of production of fruits and vegetables is wine production, but something like 50 or 60% of the pesticide usage is on grapevines that are for wine. So there's a lot of pesticide use in France for grapes, and I see this as, a movement into something a little bit more sustainable and environmentally friendly. So nice job with the bats.
Yeah, I'm curious because they're bats, and most of the time people are harvesting at night. I'm wondering if there's any issues. I can see the day, they're not out. There's no problem, but
bats
are they
more
harvesting?
Of like a dusk dawn kind of thing. So I don't know. I love bats, so I'd be happy for the bats.
I don't know if I want to be picking the grapes and they're hitting my head and stuff, but it is an interesting thing, and I think I give France a lot of credit because they're always looking. But we've seen in the past where California is always looking at managing this way as well. So it's not something totally new in the wine world. It's just something they focus on because it's bats instead of birds or hawks.
You're listening to The Wonderful World of Wine. We're your hosts, Kim and Mark. You can find out more information about me at my website, vinitaswineworks.com, and more information about Mark at franklinliquors.com. So you have an old bottle of wine that's been sitting around either in your cellar or in a closet. How do you know if that wine is still good? This was a great article from the Washington Post that we ran across, and a question that I get fairly frequently from people.
Yeah, and they said, how do you tell if the dusty bottle...
The dust is not just the bottle. bottle, that dusty bottle.
In my home, they're dusty, and my wife gets very upset. And it doesn't mean because they're old; it's just because I don't take care of it, right? So, a very common question: when to drink and what to put away, Kim. And I think a lot of times we always recommend two major things: an acidic wine and a tannic wine. And you always kind of relate a price point to what you can sit down and know when is good to drink.
Right. So this is one of those areas where a little bit of knowledge will take you far. And in this article, they pointed out 3 things that you should know to try to figure out if the wine that you have was age-worthy, because they're going on the assumption that you have this bottle and that you're not going out and buying something to put down. So look at the producer, look at the region, and look at the vintage. Now, vintage takes a little bit of research because you may have a 20-year-old bottle that you're looking at, and the year after it might have been age-worthy, whereas the one that you have in your hand isn't. So that's when going online and doing a little bit of research as far as quality of the vintage can go pretty far. But then region and producer, I actually think that region is more important here, and then do some individual research on producer. So for age-worthy wines, you really want to look at those well-regarded regions that have a track record of producing wine that does age particularly well. So we're talking about Bordeaux, we're talking about Napa, California. Some better Chiantis do too, but usually overall it's big reds that will age better than anything else.
So explain again to me, Kim, the producer you're saying hard to go by?
No, it's just, I think it's harder for people to tell because there are so many producers out there. And even in a poor vintage, a really good producer can produce a great wine. Whereas sometimes if it's a lesser producer and you have a good vintage, they might not necessarily be making a wine that is meant for aging, especially if it's a second label or, maybe it's more of a blend and isn't really meant for aging if it's like a big fruit forward kind of red.
Yeah, I like when we're on the same page because I was told a long time ago that a good producer can make a good wine no matter what the vintage gives them. So that's something to think about. But when you're looking at a producer, it can be tricky because take, for instance, Robert Mondavi. They make some high-end wine, some high-end Napa cabs, but they also make $10 Woodbridge is Robert Mondavi. So if you think Robert Mondavi $100 cab is going to taste the same as the Woodbridge cab, that could be a total misconception, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point.
The other thing about vintage is, and we've talked about all the issues with the climate, and they say it's a bad vintage, and then they'll come out and say, okay, Champagne had a horrible vintage this year. The weather was bad. They had frost. And then the vintage charts come out and they say it's a great rated vintage. So they had little fruit, but they still made good wine. So that can be tricky as well. So
those vintage charts usually don't refer to how easy of a vintage it was or how hard of a vintage it was, but the final quality of the wine coming out of that year. So that is important, I think, for people to understand because, like you just said, it could have been a really tough weather year, but the small amount of wine that they maybe got from that year turned out to be excellent quality.
And they gave 2 other little clues I thought was good information is you pick up a dusty bottle, you don't know if it's still good, and then you look and it might be leaking.
Yeah, this was
there's a big air space.
And I think this is really useful information to people because you don't need to know about vintage, you don't need to know about producer, but if you pick up that bottle and it's leaking or it's got a low, what we call fill, meaning it doesn't look like it's as full as it should be, that's important stuff to know because if you've got a leaky bottle, chances are some air has gotten in there and maybe it hasn't evolved the way that it should have.
Yeah, and then they end the article, Kim, and I thought it was a great little point they mentioned. So you find these wines. What's the best way to know if you can drink it? Get a group of friends, open it up.
Just drink it.
Right? So, either it's going to be a great experience for your friends or you're going to serve them a lot of bad wine, right? So.
Yeah. And I always tell people it's better to drink it too soon than to wait too long and have it be over the hill and not enjoyable. It's so sad when you have been holding on to a special bottle and then you open it and it falls apart. It doesn't taste good. It's oxidized or it's starting to turn to vinegar. It's really sad.
And you mentioned, Kim, vintage charts. They also, some are designed where they'll tell you if it's a 2010 Napa Cabernet, it'll tell you when it's at peak, when it's past peak, if you can still hold it. So there's a guide. But like you were saying, Kim, you can't really go by that either because I've seen it where it says it's past peak and it was tasting beautiful.
Yep, I've had that happen too. So, sometimes it just comes down to it being that individual bottle, but chances are if it's got those, leaky notes on there that you probably want to open that sooner rather than later and just see what's going on with that bottle. Thank you for listening to us today on The Wonderful World of Wine. We have been your hosts, Kim Simone and Mark Lindsay. You can visit us at our Facebook page, The Wonderful World of Wine, and leave us any questions or comments. And please also find us on iTunes under The Wonderful World of Wine.